The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand conference hall in Accra, Ghana, where 10 African leaders sat around a circular table. President Kwame Asante of Ghana looked at each face, knowing that this moment would change everything. For too long, their nations had watched their precious resources leave their shores as raw materials, only to return as expensive finished products they could barely afford. Dr. Sarah Okafor, Nigeria's Minister of Trade, spread out charts showing decades of data. The numbers told a story of exploitation that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Nigeria exported crude oil worth billions, yet many of its citizens lived without electricity. The Democratic Republic of Congo sent cobalt to power the world's smartphones and electric cars, but its people remained among the poorest on Earth. South Africa's gold-filled western vaults, while unemployment soared in its townships. President Asante stood and walked to the large window overlooking the bustling streets of Accra. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying the weight of history, "we have been suppliers for too long. Today we become partners." The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic. Below, the 10 nations represented in this room controlled an astonishing portion of the world's most critical resources. Nigeria and Angola possessed vast oil reserves that kept Western economies running. The Democratic Republic of Congo held nearly 70% of the world's cobalt, essential for every electric vehicle, battery, and smartphone. South Africa's platinum mines were irreplaceable for catalytic converters and hydrogen fuel cells. Ghana's gold reserves had been flowing to London and New York for generations. Zambia's copper wired the developed world, while Tanzania's rare earth elements powered advanced technologies. Minister Fatima al-Rashid from Morocco outlined their proposal with precision. "We will no longer export raw materials. Every ounce of copper must be processed into wire before it leaves Zambia. Every barrel of oil must be refined into gasoline and chemicals in Nigeria. Every gram of gold must be crafted into jewelry or electronic components in Ghana." Her words echoed around the room like a declaration of independence. The plan they discussed had been years in the making. Each country would specialize in processing their own resources, building the factories and training the workforce needed to add value before export. They would share technology, expertise, and even workers across borders. A Congolese engineer might help design a copper processing plant in Zambia, while a South African metallurgist could train workers in Ghana's new gold refining facility. President Joseph Mbeki from South Africa raised concerns that everyone was thinking. "The Western nations will not accept this quietly. They have built their economies on our cheap raw materials for centuries. Their stock markets, their currencies, their entire way of life depends on this arrangement." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Everyone knew the risks, but they also understood that the current system was slowly strangling their nations. Dr. Okafor pulled up projections on her laptop, connecting it to the large screen on the wall. "If we process our own materials, we can increase our export revenues by 3 to 5 times. Instead of selling crude oil for $50 per barrel, we sell refined gasoline and chemicals for $200 per barrel equivalent. Instead of selling raw cobalt for $30,000 per ton, we sell battery components for $100,000 per ton." The economics were compelling, but the challenges were enormous. They would need to build processing facilities, train skilled workers, and develop new trade relationships. Most importantly, they would need to stand together when the Western nations inevitably pushed back. President Asante knew that individually, any one of these countries could be pressured, sanctioned, or worse. Together, they controlled resources too vital for the global economy to ignore. As the day progressed, they worked through the details. Each nation would implement the export ban gradually over 18 months, giving them time to build processing capacity while preventing economic shock. They would coordinate their efforts, ensuring that if one country faced pressure, the others would support them. Most importantly, they would present a united front to the world. President Elena Nakamura from Tanzania shared her nation's experience with Chinese investment. "Beijing has been helping us build processing facilities for rare earth elements. They understand that processed materials are more valuable than raw exports. Perhaps the West needs to learn this lesson as well." Her comment sparked discussion about finding new trading partners who valued partnership over exploitation. The meeting stretched into the evening, with dinner served in the same conference room. As they ate traditional dishes from each of their countries, the conversation shifted from economics to dreams. President Mbeki spoke about young South Africans who would now have jobs in high-tech manufacturing instead of dangerous mining. Dr. Okafor imagined Nigerian cities, powered by electricity generated from their own refined oil products by midnight. They had drafted the Accra Accord, a document that would be remembered as either the beginning of Africa's economic renaissance or the spark that ignited a global trade war. The agreement was simple in its boldness. Effective immediately, the 10 signatory nations would cease all exports of unprocessed raw materials within 18 months. Every resource would be refined, processed, or manufactured into finished goods before leaving their borders. President Asante looked around the table at his colleagues, seeing determination mixed with apprehension in their faces. Tomorrow we announce our decision to the world. Tonight, we make history. The weight of their decision settled over the room like a blanket. They were about to challenge an economic system that had existed for centuries, betting their nation's futures on their ability to transform from suppliers into manufacturers. As the leaders signed the accord one by one, the sound of pens scratching on paper seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. Outside, Accra slept peacefully, unaware that its residents would wake up in a world where Africa had decided to take control of its own destiny. The morning would bring reactions from capitals around the world, but for now, 10 leaders sat in quiet contemplation of what they had just unleashed upon the global economy. The news broke at exactly 6:47 a.m. London time, when Reuters received the official statement from the African Trade Alliance. Within minutes, trading floors across 3 continents erupted into chaos. In London, copper futures dropped 23% before the opening bell. Gold prices swung wildly as traders struggled to understand what this unprecedented move meant for global supply chains. James Mitchell, head of commodities trading at Sterling Bank in London, watched his screens with growing alarm. His coffee had gone cold hours ago as he fielded panicked calls from clients across Europe. "They can't be serious," he muttered to his colleague Sarah, who was frantically calculating how much copper inventory their clients actually held. The reality was hitting them both. Western industries had operated on just-in-time delivery systems for decades, maintaining minimal stockpiles of raw materials. Across the Atlantic, Wall Street opened to a bloodbath. Tesla's stock plummeted as investors realized that 70% of the world's cobalt came from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Electric vehicle manufacturers had built their entire future on accessing cheap cobalt for batteries. Now they faced the prospect of buying expensive processed battery components instead of raw materials. They could refine themselves at lower costs. The German automotive industry, backbone of Europe's largest economy, faced an immediate crisis. BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen had massive factories designed around processing raw platinum into catalytic converters. Their entire supply chain model assumed that South African platinum would arrive in Hamburg at predictable prices. Hans Weber, CEO of Auto Components GmbH, stared at his production schedule knowing that within months, his factories might sit idle. In Washington, D.C., emergency meetings convened before dawn. Secretary of State Jennifer Harrison found herself in the Situation Room at 5 a.m., still in yesterday's clothes, briefing President Roberts on what intelligence agencies were calling the most significant economic development since the 1973 oil crisis. The implications were staggering. American manufacturing, already struggling to compete with Chinese efficiency, would now face dramatically increased input costs. The technology sector reacted with barely controlled panic. Silicon Valley companies had built the smartphone revolution on access to cheap rare earth elements from Tanzania and cobalt from Congo. Apple's supply chain executives worked through the night, calculating how much it would cost to buy processed components instead of raw materials. The premium could add hundreds of dollars to each device's production cost. President Roberts called an emergency cabinet meeting, his economic advisors painting an increasingly grim picture. "Mr. President," said Treasury Secretary Michael Chang, "these 10 nations control roughly 60% of the critical materials our economy needs. If they follow through on this threat, we're looking at inflation rates not seen since the 1980s. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. European Commission President Maria Santos faced similar briefings in Brussels. The European Union had built its Green Deal on the promise of electric vehicles and renewable energy, all dependent on materials from these African nations. Portuguese wind turbines needed rare earth magnets. German solar panels required silver and rare metals. And the entire continent's automotive industry depended on processed battery components. The dream of energy independence suddenly seemed impossibly expensive. China's response was notably different from its Western counterparts. Premier Li Wei held a press conference in Beijing, expressing support for Africa's right to develop its own processing capabilities. Chinese companies had been investing in African manufacturing for years, building relationships that Western corporations had ignored. While Western stocks tumbled, Chinese mining and processing equipment manufacturers saw their share prices soar. The first diplomatic responses came within hours. British Foreign Secretary David Williams called his counterpart in Nigeria, offering technical assistance and favorable trade terms if Nigeria reconsidered its position. The conversation was polite but firm. Nigeria would process its oil into gasoline, chemicals, and plastics before export, period. Similar calls to other alliance members received identical responses. French President Guillaume Dubois found himself in a particularly awkward position. France had maintained colonial-era trade relationships with several alliance members, importing uranium from Niger and gold from Mali at favorable rates. These arrangements had subsidized French nuclear power and maintained the country's gold reserves for decades. Now, processed uranium fuel and finished gold products would cost substantially more. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Hiroshi Tanaka convened his cabinet to discuss Japan's vulnerability. The island nation imported virtually all its raw materials, with many coming from alliance members. Japanese electronics manufacturers had built global empires on efficient processing of imported materials. Companies like Sony and Panasonic faced the prospect of dramatically increased production costs just as they were recovering from recent supply chain disruptions. Financial markets continued their downward spiral throughout the day. The London Metal Exchange suspended trading in several commodities as prices gyrated beyond normal parameters. Copper, platinum, palladium, and gold all experienced unprecedented volatility as traders tried to assess how much processed materials would actually cost. Energy markets faced particular chaos. Brent crude oil, much of it from Nigeria and Angola, dropped initially as traders assumed reduced supply. But then reality set in. These countries weren't reducing oil production, they were promising to sell refined products instead. Gasoline and diesel futures spiked as European and American refineries realized they would face competition from new African facilities. The shipping industry found itself in an unusual position. Container ships designed to carry raw materials would need retrofitting to handle processed goods. Oil tankers might need conversion to carry refined products in smaller quantities. Maersk and other major shipping companies began emergency planning sessions to understand how global cargo flows would change. By market close in New York, the Dow Jones had dropped 8%, its worst single-day decline in 2 years. European markets fared even worse, with the FTSE 100 down 12% and the German DAX losing 15% of its value. The message was clear. Global financial markets understood that cheap African raw materials had been subsidizing Western prosperity for generations. As evening fell across the affected continents, government officials and corporate executives settled in for long nights of strategic planning. Phone calls crisscrossed the globe as alliances formed and battle lines were drawn. The African Trade Alliance had fired the first shot in what was shaping up to be the most significant economic conflict since World War II. In quiet offices from London to Tokyo, analysts worked through the night calculating the true cost of decades of economic dependency. The numbers were sobering. Western economies had built themselves on a foundation of cheap African labor and raw materials. Now that foundation was shifting, and no one knew if the structures built upon it could survive the earthquake that was coming. 3 weeks after the Accra Accord announcement, the first wave of Western pressure began with surgical precision. The International Monetary Fund, under pressure from its largest contributors, announced a routine review of loan conditions for several alliance members. The timing was not coincidental. Nigeria owed $42 billion to international creditors, while South Africa's debt burden had reached concerning levels. Dr. Margaret Steinberg, the IMF's deputy managing director, arrived in Lagos with a delegation of economists and lawyers. Her message to Nigerian Finance Minister Dr. Sarah Okafor was wrapped in diplomatic language but brutally clear. Continued access to international credit markets depended on maintaining stable commodity export relationships with traditional partners. The threat hung in the air like humidity in the Nigerian capital, but Dr. Okafor had prepared for this moment. Nigeria had been quietly diversifying its creditors, securing loans from Chinese banks, Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, and even African development institutions. Dr. Steinberg, she replied calmly, Nigeria appreciates the IMF's concern, but we have adequate financing for our development needs. The meeting ended with polite smiles and underlying tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Simultaneously, the European Union launched its own pressure campaign through trade policy. Brussels announced new environmental standards for processed goods that seemed tailored specifically to exclude African manufacturers. Products would need certification from European testing facilities, a process that could take months and cost millions of dollars. The message was clear. If African nations insisted on processing their own materials, Europe would make it difficult to sell the results. President Elena Nakamura of Tanzania faced a different kind of pressure. American technology companies led by Apple and Google offered her a deal that seemed too good to refuse. They would invest $15 billion in Tanzanian processing facilities, but only if Tanzania withdrew from the alliance and resumed raw material exports to existing Western partners. The offer came with subtle threats about Tanzania's access to American technology markets. The pressure campaign extended beyond economics into diplomacy and security. France, with its extensive African military presence, began conducting training exercises near the borders of alliance members. While officially routine, the timing sent an unmistakable message. French Defense Minister Claude Rousseau made pointed comments about the importance of stability in regions where France maintained peacekeeping operations. Britain took a more subtle approach, offering Ghana a comprehensive trade agreement that would make it the gateway for African processed goods entering European markets. The deal was genuinely attractive: preferential tariffs, technical assistance, and guaranteed market access. All Ghana had to do was break with the alliance and convince other members to do the same. President Kwame Asante spent sleepless nights studying the proposal, knowing that accepting it would betray his partners but rejecting it might doom Ghana to economic isolation. The American response combined carrots and sticks with characteristic efficiency. The U.S. trade representative offered individual trade deals to each alliance member, promising access to American markets for their processed goods at preferential rates. Simultaneously, the Treasury Department announced new sanctions, targeting African officials involved in destabilizing global commodity markets. The sanctions were carefully crafted to avoid obvious racism while making clear that challenging Western economic dominance would have personal consequences. President Joseph Mbeki of South Africa found himself in the most difficult position. His country hosted the largest stock exchange in Africa, and Western investors held significant portions of South African assets. Share prices of South African mining companies collapsed as foreign investors sold their holdings. The rand weakened against the dollar, making imports more expensive and feeding inflation that hurt ordinary South Africans. The pressure worked on some alliance members. Mali, facing a severe currency crisis, quietly approached French officials about resuming gold exports under the old arrangements. The French response was swift and generous: immediate debt relief, infrastructure investment, and guaranteed purchase agreements for Malian gold. Within a week, Mali announced its withdrawal from the alliance, citing national economic interests. But the remaining 9 members doubled down on their commitment. They established the African Processing Development Bank with Chinese backing, ensuring access to capital for building manufacturing facilities. India, Brazil, and Turkey quickly expressed interest in purchasing processed African goods, reducing dependence on Western markets. Most importantly, Russia announced massive investments in African processing facilities, seeing an opportunity to challenge Western economic dominance. The technological pressure proved more challenging than expected. Microsoft announced that its cloud services would no longer be available to African processing facilities involved in disrupting global supply chains. Google restricted access to industrial software that many manufacturing processes required. These moves backfired spectacularly, as Chinese technology companies immediately filled the gap with competitive alternatives. Behind closed doors, Western intelligence agencies worked overtime to find leverage against alliance leaders. Swiss banks received informal requests to review accounts held by African officials. British courts suddenly found reasons to investigate African-owned properties in London. American universities questioned the visa status of African students whose parents worked for alliance governments. The Chinese saw opportunity in Western pressure tactics and moved aggressively to support the alliance. President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Processing Initiative, promising $50 billion in loans and technical assistance to help African nations build manufacturing capacity. Chinese companies began shipping equipment and sending engineers to alliance countries at unprecedented speed. Dr. Okafor traveled to Beijing for high-level discussions about Nigeria's refinery expansion. The Chinese offered not just financing but technology transfer, training programs, and guaranteed markets for Nigerian processed products. The contrast with Western threats was stark. Where the IMF offered conditions and restrictions, China offered partnership and growth. The pressure campaign's most dramatic moment came when the World Bank announced the suspension of funding for infrastructure projects in alliance countries. Bank President Robert Martinez framed the decision as concern over fiscal responsibility and sustainable development. The real message was simpler: challenge the global economic order, and international development finance would disappear. Alliance members responded by establishing their own development financing mechanisms. The African Infrastructure Investment Bank, capitalized with Chinese, Russian, and Middle Eastern funds, began operations within months. India announced the South-South Development Partnership, offering technical assistance and favorable loans to alliance members. As the pressure campaign intensified, cracks began appearing in Western solidarity. German industrial companies, facing massive increases in input costs, began lobbying their government to negotiate with the alliance rather than pressure it. Italian manufacturers made similar arguments, pointing out that processed African goods might actually be cheaper than maintaining their own processing facilities. The pressure campaign reached its peak when President Roberts announced targeted sanctions against alliance leaders, freezing their assets in American banks and banning their travel to the United States. The European Union and Britain imposed similar measures, creating a wall of economic isolation around alliance members. But the sanctions backfired in ways Western leaders hadn't anticipated. African public opinion rallied around their sanctioned leaders, seeing them as heroes standing up to colonial-era exploitation. Other developing nations began questioning their own relationships with Western partners, wondering if they too would face sanctions for challenging economic arrangements that favored rich countries. 3 months after the Accra Accord, the pressure campaign had achieved mixed results. Mali had withdrawn from the alliance, but the remaining 9 members were more united than ever. They had secured alternative financing, found new markets for their products, and built public support for their position. Most importantly, they had called the West's bluff and discovered that the global economy needed African resources more than Africa needed Western approval. The construction cranes appeared on the horizon like mechanical forests, stretching across the landscapes of 9 African nations. In Lagos, Nigeria, what had been empty farmland 6 months ago now bustled with workers building the largest oil refinery in West Africa. Chinese engineers worked alongside Nigerian graduates fresh from universities in petroleum engineering, their hard hats dotting the construction site like colorful confetti against the red earth. Sarah Okafor, now Nigeria's Minister of Industrial Development, stood atop a temporary observation platform, watching welders assemble massive distillation towers. The refinery would process 2 million barrels of crude oil daily into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and petrochemicals. More importantly, it would employ 15,000 Nigerians in high-skilled jobs that previously existed only in Texas and Louisiana. The transformation was happening simultaneously across the alliance. In Lubumbashi, Democratic Republic of Congo, cobalt processing facilities rose from the mining heartland where raw ore had been extracted for decades. Dr. Marie Kabila, a Congolese chemical engineer who had returned from Belgium to lead the project, supervised the installation of equipment that would transform raw cobalt into battery-grade materials worth 10 times more than the unprocessed metal. These weren't simple assembly operations but sophisticated manufacturing complexes that required years of planning and billions of dollars in investment. The alliance had partnered with China, India, Turkey, and Brazil to access the technology and expertise needed to build modern processing facilities. Young Africans who might have migrated to Europe for opportunities now found high-paying jobs in their home countries. President Kwame Asante visited the new gold processing facility in Accra, where Ghanaian workers operated German machinery to produce electronic components and jewelry. The facility employed 2,000 people and generated 5 times more revenue per ounce of gold than raw exports had provided. More importantly, it was training a new generation of skilled technicians and engineers who would drive Ghana's industrial future. The learning curve was steep but manageable. Alliance countries had sent thousands of students to Chinese and Indian universities over the past decade, creating a pool of trained professionals ready to staff these new facilities. South African metallurgists with decades of mining experience became consultants helping other alliance members optimize their processing operations. Nigerian petroleum engineers shared expertise with Angola's new refining projects. The social impact was immediate and transformative. In Zambian copper towns that had struggled with unemployment as raw copper exports provided few jobs, new wire and cable manufacturing plants employed thousands of workers. Young people who had contemplated dangerous migrations to Europe instead enrolled in technical training programs preparing them for careers in advanced manufacturing. President Joseph Mbeki toured a new platinum processing facility in Rustenburg, South Africa, where catalytic converters for automobiles were manufactured instead of shipping raw platinum to German factories. The facility's manager, Jennifer Molifi, had earned her engineering degree in Germany but returned to South Africa when she heard about the opportunities in domestic processing. "We're not just making products," she explained to President Mbeki. "We're building an industrial base that will last generations." The alliance faced technical challenges that tested their resolve. Processing rare earth elements required sophisticated chemical processes that few countries had mastered. Tanzania partnered with Chinese rare earth companies to build facilities that could handle the complex separation and purification required to produce high-grade materials for electronics and renewable energy. Systems quality control became a crucial battleground. Western buyers, initially skeptical of African processing capabilities, imposed stringent quality standards that alliance members had to meet or exceed. This drove innovation and improvement, forcing African manufacturers to adopt the highest international standards. Within months, African processed materials were matching or exceeding the quality of similar products from established manufacturers. The economic transformation was measurable in employment statistics and export revenues. Nigeria's processed petroleum exports generated 3 times more revenue than raw crude had provided, while employing 5 times more workers. Ghana's gold processing facilities created jobs for skilled technicians, engineers, and support staff throughout the supply chain. Each processed product required transportation, logistics, quality testing, and export services that multiplied the economic impact. Training programs became crucial to success. The alliance established the African Institute of Technology, with campuses in each member country, offering degrees in chemical engineering, metallurgy, industrial design, and advanced manufacturing. Students studied curricula developed in partnership with Chinese, Indian, and Turkish universities, ensuring they learned the latest techniques and technologies. The gender impact was particularly noteworthy. Traditional mining had employed primarily men in dangerous conditions, but processing facilities needed diverse skills including laboratory technicians, quality control specialists, and administrative professionals. Women found opportunities in these new industries that had been unavailable in raw materials extraction. Environmental benefits emerged as an unexpected advantage. Modern processing facilities included pollution control systems and waste management technologies that were often superior to older Western plants. Alliance countries leapfrogged older technologies, adopting clean manufacturing processes that reduced environmental impact while improving product quality. The alliance also invested heavily in research and development. The African Materials Research Center, jointly funded by all member countries, began developing proprietary processing technologies that could give African manufacturers competitive advantages. Young African scientists who had completed PhDs in Europe and America returned home to lead research programs that could create the next generation of industrial innovations. Supply chain development became a crucial focus. Processing raw materials required sophisticated logistics, quality control systems, and transportation networks. Alliance countries invested in ports, railways, and airports capable of handling high-value processed goods instead of bulk raw materials. New cargo handling facilities in Durban, Lagos, and Accra specialized in processed products requiring careful handling and secure storage. The speed of transformation surprised even alliance leaders. Within 8 months of the Accra Accord, processing facilities were coming online ahead of schedule. Chinese equipment manufacturers, eager to expand their global market share, provided machinery and technical support on accelerated timelines. Indian engineering firms sent teams of specialists to train African workers and optimize production processes. International quality certifications became badges of honor for African manufacturers. When Nigeria's first refined gasoline shipments met European fuel standards, celebration erupted in Lagos. South African catalytic converters earned ISO certification from German testing facilities, proving that African manufacturing could match global standards. The multiplier effects rippled through alliance economies. Processing facilities needed local suppliers for everything from safety equipment to maintenance services. New businesses emerged to support the manufacturing sector, creating jobs in construction, transportation, food service, and professional services. Local banks developed expertise in financing industrial operations, reducing dependence on foreign capital. As the first anniversary of the Accra Accord approached, the manufacturing revolution had exceeded even optimistic projections. Alliance countries had successfully transitioned from raw material suppliers to sophisticated manufacturers, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs while dramatically increasing export revenues. The foundation had been laid for sustained economic growth based on value-added production rather than resource extraction. The transformation was visible from space as lights blazed from new industrial complexes across the African continent. What had been a bold gamble 12 months earlier was becoming an undeniable success story that would reshape global economics for generations to come. The dominoes began falling on a gray Tuesday morning in London, when Sterling Bank announced it could no longer meet its obligations to commodities traders. The bank had bet heavily that African nations would eventually cave to international pressure and resume raw material exports. Instead, those nations were now selling processed goods at prices that made Western manufacturing uncompetitive. Sterling's bankruptcy was just the first tremor in an economic earthquake that would reshape the global economy. James Mitchell, the commodities trader who had watched the initial market panic 18 months earlier, sat in his empty office packing personal belongings into cardboard boxes. His trading floor, once bustling with activity, was nearly deserted. The fundamental assumption underlying his career, that Western financial institutions controlled global commodity flows, had proven catastrophically wrong. African nations had successfully bypassed London's commodity exchanges entirely, selling their processed goods through new trading platforms based in Shanghai, Mumbai, and Istanbul. The collapse accelerated as European manufacturers faced an impossible choice: pay dramatically higher prices for African processed goods or shut down operations entirely. Volkswagen's main assembly plant in Wolfsburg reduced production by 60% as battery costs soared. The company had built its electric vehicle strategy around cheap cobalt from Congo, but now faced competition from Chinese manufacturers who had secured long-term contracts with Congo's new battery component factories. Hans Weber, CEO of Auto Components GmbH, made the devastating decision to close 3 German factories employing 12,000 workers. "We simply cannot compete when our input costs are triple those of our Chinese competitors," he announced to shareholders. Chinese automotive suppliers, working directly with alliance processing facilities, could deliver catalytic converters and battery components at prices that undercut traditional European suppliers by 40%. The unemployment statistics told the story of Western industrial decline. Germany's unemployment rate rose from 4.2% to 8.7% in just 6 months as manufacturing companies either closed or relocated operations to alliance countries where processed materials were available at competitive prices. French automotive employment dropped by 200,000 jobs as companies struggled with the new economics of industrial production. Financial markets reflected the industrial reality with brutal honesty. The FTSE 100 had lost 45% of its value since the Accra Accord, while the German DAX dropped 52%. European pension funds, heavily invested in industrial companies, faced massive losses that threatened retirement security for millions of workers. The European Central Bank found itself printing money at unprecedented rates just to prevent complete financial system collapse. American manufacturers faced similar devastation. Tesla's stock price collapsed as the company struggled to secure affordable battery components. Elon Musk's ambitious electric vehicle targets became impossible to meet when battery costs doubled seemingly overnight. The company was forced to negotiate directly with Congolese battery manufacturers, accepting prices and terms that eliminated most profit margins on their vehicles. The technology sector experienced its own version of collapse. Apple announced that iPhone prices would increase by $300 to cover the cost of processed rare earth components from Tanzania. Consumers balked at paying $1,500 for smartphones, and Apple's market share began declining for the first time in 2 decades. Samsung and other competitors faced identical pressures, making the entire smartphone industry suddenly vulnerable to Chinese manufacturers who had secured favorable deals with alliance processing facilities. Currency markets reflected the shifting economic reality as Western currencies weakened against those of alliance countries. The Nigerian naira, historically worth almost nothing against the dollar, strengthened dramatically as Nigeria's processed petroleum exports generated massive foreign currency earnings. South Africa's rand recovered from years of decline as platinum processing generated unprecedented export revenues. The social impact in Western countries was immediate and painful. British manufacturing towns that had struggled since deindustrialization in the 1980s faced another wave of factory closures. Sheffield, once proud center of steel production, watched its remaining metal processing facilities shut down as they could no longer access affordable raw materials. Workers who had retrained for advanced manufacturing found themselves unemployed again, as production moved to countries with better access to processed materials. French President Guillaume Dubois faced massive protests as unemployment soared and living standards declined. The Yellow Vest movement, dormant for years, returned with renewed fury as French workers demanded government action to address the economic crisis. Dubois had few options. The alliance countries were offering to sell their processed goods at fair market prices, but those prices made French manufacturing uncompetitive globally. The energy sector collapse was particularly dramatic. European oil refineries built to process crude oil from Nigeria and Angola sat idle as those countries now sold refined gasoline and chemicals directly to consumers. The port of Rotterdam, Europe's largest oil trading hub, became a ghost town as tankers carrying African refined products bypassed European facilities entirely. British Prime Minister Catherine Walsh faced a parliamentary crisis as Conservative MPs demanded action to restore Britain's access to affordable raw materials. But Britain's leverage had evaporated along with its industrial base. The alliance countries were perfectly willing to trade with Britain. They just insisted on selling processed goods instead of raw materials, and at prices that reflected the true value of their resources. The ripple effects spread through Western service economies. Shipping companies faced bankruptcy as bulk commodity transport declined dramatically. The Baltic Dry Index, measuring the cost of shipping raw materials, collapsed as alliance countries shipped smaller quantities of high-value processed goods instead of massive volumes of raw materials. Maersk and other shipping giants were forced to restructure their entire business models. Insurance companies struggled with claims from manufacturing companies whose business models had become obsolete overnight. Lloyd's of London faced its largest crisis since the asbestos claims of the 1990s, as industrial companies sought compensation for losses caused by the African trade policies. But insurance policies had never contemplated the possibility that raw material suppliers would simply stop supplying raw materials. the collapse extended beyond manufacturing into financial services. London's status as a global commodity trading center evaporated as trading moved to exchanges in alliance countries or their new partners. The London Metal Exchange, which had set global prices for copper, aluminum, and other metals for over a century, became irrelevant as prices were now determined by processors in Zambia and South Africa. Universities and research institutions felt the impact as industrial funding disappeared. Cambridge University's Materials Science Department lost 60% of its corporate funding as British companies could no longer afford advanced research programs. The brain drain accelerated as European engineers and scientists emigrated to alliance countries where industrial jobs were booming. The political consequences were severe and immediate. Traditional political parties in Western countries found themselves without answers to the economic crisis. Right-wing populist movements gained support by promising to force African countries back into their historical roles as raw material suppliers, but offered no realistic mechanisms to achieve this goal. Left-wing parties advocated for government intervention but lacked the resources to subsidize entire industrial sectors. President Roberts faced congressional hearings investigating how American intelligence agencies had failed to predict the economic consequences of the African alliance. The hearings revealed that Western governments had been so confident in their economic dominance that they had never seriously considered the possibility of supplier nations organizing effective resistance. As Western economies contracted, the human cost mounted. Unemployment, declining living standards, and social unrest created conditions not seen since the Great Depression. Food prices rose as agricultural machinery became more expensive to manufacture without affordable raw materials. Energy costs soared as refined petroleum products carried premium prices that raw crude oil had never commanded. The final humiliation came when several Western companies began relocating their manufacturing operations to alliance countries. BMW announced it would build a new electric vehicle factory in South Africa to access affordable processed materials. The irony was complete. Western companies were now investing in African manufacturing facilities to remain competitive in global markets, reversing a century of economic colonialism in the span of 2 devastating years. 5 years after the Accra Accord, the world had fundamentally changed. President Kwame Asante stood before the newly constructed African Union headquarters in Accra, Ghana, addressing leaders from across the globe who had come to negotiate trade agreements with the alliance that had reshaped international commerce. The building itself, constructed with processed materials from alliance countries and designed by African architects, symbolized the continent's